The FBI SWAT team hit the double doors of St. Jude's emergency room at 2 in the morning, weapons drawn terrifying the night shift staff. They weren't looking for a fugitive hiding in the bathroom. They weren't looking for a terror suspect in the waiting area. They marched straight past the trembling chief of surgery and cornered the quiet middle-aged nurse changing an IV bag in Bay 4. Dr. Julian Hartwell screamed, "That's just Sarah. She's a nobody. Leave her alone." The lead agent didn't even look at him. He holstered his weapon, stood at attention, and saluted the nobody. "Captain Hayes," he said, his voice shaking, "we need you. The President of the United States is asking for you by name." 12 hours earlier, everything had been different. The annual St. Jude's Medical Center Charity Gala was the kind of event that made Sarah Hayes want to crawl out of her own skin. The hospital ballroom had been transformed into a glittering temple of wealth and self-congratulation, with crystal chandeliers casting prismatic rainbows across silk tablecloths and ice sculptures shaped like caduceus symbols, slowly weeping in the warmth of 500 bodies packed into a space designed for 300. Board members in tuxedos clinked champagne flutes with pharmaceutical executives. Surgeons with god complexes held court at circular tables, their trophy wives dripping with diamonds that cost more than Sarah's annual salary. The air was thick with expensive perfume, political ambition, and the particular kind of laughter that people make when they want everyone to know they're having a wonderful time. Sarah stood alone by the punch bowl, and she had never felt more exposed in her entire life. She was wearing a scarlet red dress that she had borrowed from Emma Wallace, the young nursing student who had absolutely insisted, that Sarah couldn't wear scrubs to a black tie event. The dress hugged curves that Sarah usually hid beneath shapeless hospital blues, and the heels that came with it made her feel like she was walking on stilts over a pit of crocodiles. Her blonde hair, usually scraped back into a messy bun that she barely thought about, had been curled and styled into something that the girl at the salon had called elegant waves. She looked beautiful. She knew this because 3 different donors had told her so, their eyes lingering a little too long on the neckline of that red dress before their wives steered them away. She hated every second of it. Her eyes kept drifting to the exits, counting them, automatically calculating sight lines and choke points, and the fastest route to the parking garage. There were 4 security guards in the room, all of them more interested in the open bar than in actually securing anything. The emergency exit behind the stage had a broken latch that nobody had fixed in 6 months. The kitchen entrance was propped open because the catering staff kept going out to smoke. Old habits, she told herself, forcing her gaze back to the crowd. Old habits that didn't belong in her new life. For 3 years, Sarah Hayes had been a ghost. Her apartment in the Capitol Hill district was a study in deliberate emptiness, with bare walls where photographs should have hung, and no mail that arrived addressed to anyone but Sarah Hayes. She paid her bills in cash, or with prepaid cards that she bought at different grocery stores each month, never the same one twice. She drove a gray 2014 Honda Civic that was practically invisible in any parking lot in America, and she had chosen it specifically for that quality. She had built this life from nothing, brick by careful brick, and tonight she felt like someone had stripped away all her carefully constructed walls and left her standing naked in a spotlight. The punch was too sweet and the champagne gave her a headache, but Sarah stood there anyway, because attendance at the gala was mandatory for all hospital staff. The invitation had called them our hospital family, which was corporate speak for unpaid atmosphere, and Sarah had learned long ago to pick her battles. She sipped her punch and watched the crowd and tried not to think about the knife that she usually kept strapped to her thigh, the one that wasn't there tonight because there was nowhere to hide it in a dress like this. She felt naked without it. Vulnerable. Wrong. Well. Look who decided to pretend she's a real person for once. The voice hit Sarah like a slap across the face, and she didn't need to turn around to know who it belonged to. Doctor. Julian Hartwell had a way of announcing himself that reminded her of approaching artillery fire, loud and destructive and impossible to ignore. He materialized at her elbow with a champagne flute in one hand and a smirk on his face that she'd grown to despise over 3 years of night shifts and verbal abuse. At 38, Julian Hartwell was the golden boy of St. Jude's Medical Center, the kind of surgeon who appeared on magazine covers and gave TED Talks about innovation in trauma care. He was tall and handsome, in a way that he clearly knew and exploited, with perfect teeth and perfectly styled hair, and a perfectly enormous ego that took up more space than his physical body. Dr. Hartwell Sarah said, keeping her voice soft and her eyes downcast. "Good evening. Is it I hadn't noticed?" He took a long sip of his champagne while his eyes crawled over her dress in a way that made her skin prickle. Trying to look human for once, Hayes. I have to say it's an improvement. You almost look like you belong somewhere other than scrubbing bedpans. There was a small cluster of donors nearby, and they were watching this exchange with the kind of polite interest that meant they were absolutely listening to every word. Sarah felt their eyes on her like physical weights, and she forced herself to stay perfectly still, perfectly meek, perfectly invisible, despite the red dress that made invisibility impossible. "Thank you, doctor," she managed. That wasn't a compliment. He turned to the donors with a laugh that invited them to share in the joke at her expense. "This is the night shift nurse I was telling you about, Sarah Hayes. She's been here, 3 years now. Does exactly what she's told, never causes any trouble, never has an original thought in her head. The perfect employee, really. Like furniture that occasionally takes a pulse." The donors chuckled politely, though one woman had the grace to look uncomfortable. Inside her mind, Sarah was cataloging Julian Hartwell with the cold precision of a targeting computer. Weak left knee from a tennis injury he bragged about constantly. Drinks too much after surgery's hands start shaking by 10 p.m. Narcissistic personality disorder with a possible sociopathic streak. Treats subordinates like servants because he's secretly terrified that he's not as brilliant as everyone thinks he is. She could destroy him with 6 words whispered to the right board member. She could end his career with the information she had accumulated over 3 years of watching and listening and being invisible. Instead, she lowered her eyes and said nothing. "You know what I love about Hayes." Hartwell continued warming to his audience. "She never argues, never pushes back. Just takes whatever you give her and keeps on shuffling along. The other nurses could learn something from her, the perfect drone, completely forgettable." He turned back to Sarah with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're dismissed, Hayes. Go check on patients or something. You're bringing down the energy in here." "Yes, doctor." She set down her punch cup and turned to walk away, keeping her steps small and shuffling, even though the heels made it difficult. She passed a group of younger nurses near the door, and she heard one of them whisper something that included the words sad and pathetic. Emma Wallace, the nursing student with the bright pink scrubs and the eyes that hadn't yet seen enough death to lose their shine, followed her into the hallway. "Sarah, wait." Emma caught up with her near the elevator bank, her young face flushed with indignation on Sarah's behalf. "That was horrible. The way he talks to you, the things he says, I don't know how you stand it." Sarah pressed the button for the elevator and kept her face neutral. "Dr. Hartwell is under a lot of pressure. The gala, the donors, the new surgical wing he's trying to get funded. He takes it out on the easiest target. That doesn't make it okay. It doesn't have to be okay." The elevator arrived with a soft chime. It just has to be survived. Keeping the patients alive matters, Emma. Everything else is just noise. Emma grabbed her arm before she could step into the elevator. "But surely you did something before this. You know so much, the way you handled trauma cases, the way you stitched up that biker last week. Dr. Evans said he'd never seen suture work that clean. He said it looked like military-grade work." Sarah felt something cold clench in her chest, but she kept her face perfectly blank. "My father was a tailor. I have steady hands. That's all." She stepped into the elevator before Emma could ask any more questions, and as the doors closed on the younger woman's confused face, Sarah leaned against the wall and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. 3 years of building Sarah Hayes. 3 years of being invisible. One compliment about her suture work, and it could all come crashing down. The locker room on the 3rd floor was empty when Sarah arrived, which was exactly what she needed. She stood in front of the mirror for a long moment, staring at the woman in the red dress who stared back at her. And then she began the process of becoming invisible again. The dress came off first, carefully folded and placed in her locker, because it belonged to Emma and Emma had been kind enough to lend it. Beneath the dress, her body told a story that the elegant fabric had hidden. Scars crisscrossed her torso like a roadmap of violent silvery lines of healed tissue that marked bullet wounds and shrapnel tears and the kind of injuries that no nurse should ever have. A particularly thick scar ran along her ribcage on the left side, and she traced it absently with one finger, remembering the explosion that had created it. The smell of burning fuel and the screaming of men who were no longer screaming by the time the medics arrived. She pulled on her navy blue scrubs, shapeless and generic, and wonderful in their anonymity. The fabric swallowed her figure, transformed her from the woman in the red dress into just another hospital worker, indistinguishable from 100 others. Her hair went up into a messy bun secured with a single elastic band. Her glasses came out of her locker, thick-framed and unflattering, another layer of camouflage. The last thing she did was strap a small scalpel to her ankle, hidden beneath the hem of her scrub pants. It was against hospital policy, technically a fireable offense if anyone ever discovered it, but old habits didn't die. They just went dormant, waiting for the moment when they'd be needed again. She looked in the mirror one more time. Sarah Hayes looked back at her invisible and forgettable and safe. She walked to the break room to start her night shift, and the television in the corner was tuned to CNN. The news anchor was talking about a failed diplomatic convoy extraction somewhere in Eastern Europe, showing footage of burning vehicles and soldiers running through smoke. Sarah watched for exactly 3 seconds. Her eyes found the blast pattern on the side of an armored Humvee, and her mind automatically cataloged it. RPG-29 Vampire. Russian-made armor-piercing tandem warhead. The angle of impact suggested professional operators, not insurgents. Someone had specifically targeted that convoy with military-grade equipment and military-grade training. She forced herself to look away. That wasn't her world anymore. She wasn't Captain Evelyn Cross anymore. She was Sarah Hayes, and Sarah Hayes cared about catheters and blood pressure readings and making sure that nobody died on her watch. She poured herself a cup of stale coffee and settled into the rhythm of the night shift. The hours crept by in the familiar pattern of emergencies and boredom that defined life in a hospital after midnight. A car accident victim came in at 11, and Sarah assisted in surgery, her hands steady and sure as she passed instruments and monitored vitals. A homeless man wandered into the emergency room at 12:30, more lonely than sick, and Sarah sat with him for 15 minutes and listened to his stories about a daughter who never visited and a life that had taken too many wrong turns. At one point, a tray crashed in the hallway outside, and Sarah noticed that she didn't flinch at the sound. Instead, she shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, and her eyes darted to the exits, calculating angles and distances before her conscious mind even registered what she was doing. By the time she realized it, her body was already returning to its relaxed posture. But the young orderly who had dropped the tray was staring at her with a strange expression. "You okay, Nurse Hayes?" he asked. "You looked like you were about to jump out of your skin." I'm fine," she said, and smiled the soft, forgettable smile of Sarah Hayes. "You startled me, that's all." Dr. Hartwell arrived for his shift at midnight, still slightly drunk from the gala and in an even fouler mood than usual. He found Sarah in the medication room and berated her for 4 minutes about a supply order that hadn't been her responsibility, and she stood there and took it because that was what Sarah Hayes did. Inside in the place where Captain Evelyn Cross still lived, she was thinking about the 16 different ways she could incapacitate him before he even knew what was happening. She didn't do any of them. She just nodded and apologized and waited for him to finish. And when he stormed out, she went back to her rounds and pretended that nothing had happened. This was the deal she had made with herself. Be invisible, be boring, be safe. For 3 years it had worked. She didn't know that in less than an hour everything was going to change. The alarm shattered the relative quiet of the night shift at exactly 11 p.m. Code Blue ICU. Code Blue ICU. Room 404. Sarah was restocking a medication cart on the second floor when the announcement crackled through the overhead speakers, and she felt something cold slide down her spine. Room 404 wasn't her floor. The ICU was technically a separate department with its own nursing staff, but she knew that they were short-staffed tonight because half the regular team had called in sick with the flu that was working its way through the hospital. Before she had time to think about what she was doing, she was moving. The other nurses on the floor ran toward the elevators with the kind of frantic energy that came from adrenaline and fear, their shoes squeaking against the linoleum and their badges flapping against their chests. Sarah didn't run like that. Well, she couldn't. Something in the way she had been trained made that kind of panicked movement physically impossible. Instead, she moved with a fluid efficiency that anyone watching closely would have found deeply unsettling. Her center of gravity lowered her head, stayed level, and she seemed to glide through the chaos of the hallway, dodging gurneys and startled visitors without breaking stride or making a sound. She bypassed the crowd waiting for the elevator and hit the stairwell door, taking the steps 2 at a time in near silence. She reached the 4th floor in half the time it would have taken the elevator, and she wasn't even breathing hard when she pushed through the ICU doors and followed the sounds of screaming to room 404. The scene inside was chaos. A patient, a John Doe, who had been admitted earlier that evening with multiple gunshot wounds, was thrashing violently in his bed. He was enormous, easily 6'4" and 250 pounds of muscle, even in his critical condition, and he had already thrown off two junior nurses who were scrambling backward with terror in their eyes. Blood was spraying from a central line that he had ripped from his chest, painting the white sheets and the white walls with arterial red. The monitors were screaming alarms, a cacophony of electronic panic that seemed to fuel his frenzy. But it wasn't the blood or the violence that made Sarah freeze in the doorway. It was the words he was screaming. Zasada oni zides, Zasada Russian. The man was screaming in Russian, and Sarah understood every word. Ambush. They are here. The cold feeling in her spine turned to ice in her veins, and for one terrible moment, Sarah Hayes and Captain Evelyn Cross existed in the same body, staring at a ghost from a life she had buried 10 years ago. Get off him! Sarah's voice cracked through the chaos like a whip, and even she was startled by the authority in it. The soft, forgettable murmur of Nurse Hayes was gone, replaced by something harder and sharper, and far more dangerous. You're not helping him. Get back! The junior nurses scrambled away from the bed, too shocked by her tone to argue. The patient seized the opportunity to grab a metal IV pole that had been knocked over in the struggle, swinging it at the head of a male nurse who had been trying to restrain his legs. The man went down hard, clutching his jaw, and suddenly the patient was free and swinging the pole in a wide arc that would have crushed the skull of anyone it connected with. Sarah stepped into the arc of the swing. To the terrified nurses watching from the doorway, what happened next was a blur of motion too fast to follow. To Sarah, time slowed down the way it always did in combat, the way her instructors had trained her to perceive it 20 years ago in a facility that officially didn't exist. She ducked under the swing with a fraction of an inch to spare, feeling the wind of the metal pole brush her hair. In the same motion, she stepped inside his guard, far too close for him to use the pole effectively. Her hip connected with his center mass, using his own momentum against him, and her right hand found the ulnar nerve in his arm with the precision of a surgeon. He roared with pain and dropped the pole, but he was still fighting, still dangerous, his free hand reaching for her throat. Sarah swept his leg, dropping her weight at exactly the right angle, and the giant man collapsed back onto the bed with a force that made the frame groan. She was on top of him before he could rise, but not pinning him with brute force. That would have been stupid against someone his size. Instead, she leaned close to his ear and spoke in a language she hadn't used in 10 years. Spokojno, brat. Tai vi bezopasnosti. Yasvoya. Easy, brother. You are safe. I am friend. The effect was instantaneous. The wild panic drained from his eyes like water from a broken vessel, replaced by confusion and something that looked almost like recognition. He stopped fighting. His massive hands, which had been reaching for her, fell to his sides. Sarah stood up slowly, smoothing her scrubs and trying to control the pounding of her heart. She looked around the room and found exactly what she had feared. Everyone was staring at her. The junior nurses still pressed against the walls, the male nurse sitting up and rubbing his jaw, and Dr. Julian Hartwell standing in the doorway with an expression of utter disbelief on his perfect face. What the hell was that? Hartwell demanded. What did you say to him? What language was that? Sarah felt Captain Cross receding, felt Sarah Hayes rushing forward to fill the void. She lowered her eyes, hunched her shoulders, made herself small and harmless and forgettable. I'm sorry, doctor. I just acted on instinct. My nephews wrestle, they're big boys. I learned a few tricks to get them to bed when they're wound up. And the words were just nonsense, really soothing sounds. Sometimes it calms people down if you speak softly enough, the words don't matter. Hartwell stared at her for a long moment, his surgeon's eyes cataloging details that Sarah desperately hoped he would dismiss. The way she had moved too fast and too precise for a middle-aged nurse. The bruises that were already forming on the patient's arm where she had grabbed him, marks that suggested real training. The fact that the patient who had been screaming in Russian 30 seconds ago was now lying peacefully on the bed as if he had been sedated. Right, Hartwell said slowly. Clean this mess up, Hayes. The police are coming to interview him about the gunshot wounds. Don't leave this room until they get here. Yes, doctor. Hartwell turned and left, but Sarah could tell from the set of his shoulders that he didn't believe her story. Not completely. She had made a mistake tonight. Let too much of Captain Cross show through, and she would have to be more careful from now on. But that thought evaporated when she turned back to the patient and found his eyes locked onto hers. The room had emptied. The nurses had fled to process their shock elsewhere, and the police had been delayed by something happening on the highway. Sarah was alone with the man on the bed, and she used the temporary privacy to check his wounds with efficient clinical detachment, Multiple gunshot wounds to the thorax, entry wounds consistent with high-caliber rifle rounds. The surgeons had done good work stabilizing him, but he had lost a lot of blood and his pulse was thready under her fingers. He should have been unconscious, or at least sedated into compliance, but his eyes tracked her movements with a clarity that made her deeply uneasy. She pulled his gown aside slightly, checking the bandages around his chest, and that was when she saw it. On his left shoulder, faded and scarred over by years and violence, was a tattoo. A winged dagger wrapped in lightning bolts. Sarah's hands went still. Her breath stopped in her throat. Task Force 141. Her old unit. The unit that had died in Syria 10 years ago. The man's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone in his condition. He pulled her close, his cracked lips moving to form words that she had never expected to hear again. "Hayes!" he rasped, and his accent was Russian, but his English was clear enough. "Captain Hayes, I found you." "You have the wrong person," Sarah whispered, but her voice was shaking. "I'm just a nurse. I don't know what you're talking about." "Evelyn Cross," he said, and her real name in his mouth hit her like a physical blow. "Call sign Eve. They told me you were dead. Helicopter crash in Germany 2014. But I knew. I always knew." Sarah looked at his face, really looked, and the years fell away. She knew this man. Dmitry Volkov, Russian intelligence officer, who had defected to the Americans in 2011. Her team had used him as an informant, twice extracting him from hostile territory and debriefing him in safe houses that smelled like cigarette smoke and fear. "Dmitry," she breathed, "what are you doing here? How did you find me?" "They are coming, Eve." His grip on her wrist tightened, and she saw real terror in his eyes. "Black Phoenix, Kane's men. They tracked me here. And when they find me, they will find you." The name hit her like a bucket of ice water. Kane. Dominic Kane. "That's impossible," Sarah said. "Kane thinks I'm dead. Everyone thinks I'm dead." Dmitry shook his head weakly. "He never believed. He's been hunting for you for 10 years. And I led him right to your door." He motioned toward his abdomen, and Sarah's eyes followed. There was a fresh surgical scar there, but it looked wrong, irritated in a way that suggested something more than simple surgery. She pressed her fingers against the tissue, and she felt something hard beneath the skin. Metal, rectangular. "You implanted it," she said. Dmitry nodded. "The evidence, the arms deal, the names of everyone involved, proof of what they did to your team." His eyes were starting to drift closed, his strength failing. "I came to give it to you, Eve. It's the only way to stop him. The only way to make them pay for what they did." Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy boots, not the soft-soled shoes of hospital staff. The sound of men who were trained to move quietly but couldn't quite manage it on unfamiliar terrain. They were here. Kane's men were already here. Dmitry, Sarah whispered, but his eyes had closed. His pulse was still there under her fingers, weak but steady, but he had passed out from the effort of their conversation. She was alone, unarmed, in a hospital full of innocent people, and the ghosts of her past life had finally caught up with her. Sarah retreated to the supply closet on the 4th floor, the only place in the hospital without security cameras. She locked the door behind her and leaned against the shelves of saline bags and gauze pads, forcing herself to breathe slowly, trying to regulate the panic that was clawing at her chest. She closed her eyes, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital faded, replaced by memories she had spent 10 years trying to bury. Syria, 2014. The Hindu Kush Mountains. The smell of burning jet fuel, and the screaming of the extraction helicopter, and the faces of her team, the only family she'd ever known, as they realized that they had been betrayed. She wasn't Sarah Hayes in that memory. She was Captain Evelyn Cross, call sign, Eve, lead field medic and tactical strategist for the intelligence support activity, the unit that did the wet work for Delta Force and DevGru when official channels couldn't be used. She was 32 years old, and she was the best at what she did, and she was watching everyone she loved die around her. The intel had been leaked. Someone high up in the command structure had sold them out, and the ambush had been waiting for them in a valley that should have been clear. She remembered the first explosion, the one that took out their lead vehicle. She remembered pulling wounded men from the wreckage while bullets tore through the air around her. She remembered realizing with the cold certainty that settled into her bones that no help was coming. She was the only survivor. She crawled 3 miles through hostile desert with a shattered leg, leaving a trail of blood in the sand, and when she finally reached friendly territory, she found out the truth. It wasn't enemy intelligence that had betrayed them. It was internal. A cleanup operation ordered by someone in the Pentagon who wanted her team eliminated to cover up an illegal arms deal with Syrian rebels. Weapons that had been sold to people who used them to kill American soldiers and innocent civilians alike. The man who had ordered the hit was named Dominic Kane, former CIA handler, former patriot, current CEO of a private military contractor called Black Phoenix that made money from chaos and death. He had been her handler once years ago. She had trusted him. 2 weeks after Syria, Captain Evelyn Cross died in a helicopter crash in Germany. The official report said there were no survivors. The funeral was held with an empty casket. In reality, she ran. She used every tradecraft skill she had accumulated over a decade of black operations to build a new identity from scratch. She chose the name Sarah Hayes because it was common and forgettable. She chose Seattle because it was far from Washington and crowded enough to hide in. She chose nursing because it was the only thing she knew how to do that didn't involve taking lives. For 10 years, it had worked. But now, Dmitry Volkov was lying in room 404 with evidence of Kane's crimes implanted in his body, and Black Phoenix mercenaries were walking the halls of her hospital, and the fragile peace that Sarah Hayes had built was crumbling around her. She opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They were shaking something that hadn't happened in a very long time. She clenched them into fists until the shaking stopped. Then she reached into the hollowed-out stack of sterile gloves on the top shelf and pulled out a burner phone that she had hidden there 3 years ago just in case. It was time to find out exactly how much trouble she was in. Sarah slipped out of the supply closet with her face composed into the mask of Nurse Hayes, meek and forgettable and completely unremarkable. But the moment she stepped into the hallway, she knew that something had changed while she was hiding. The atmosphere of the hospital had shifted in a way that most people wouldn't have noticed, but to someone with Sarah's training, the change was as obvious as a scream. The ambient noise level had dropped, conversations dying away into whispers. The usual bustle of the night shift had slowed to a crawl, and there were people in the hallways who didn't belong there. She spotted the first pair near the fire exit at the end of the corridor. 2 men in dark windbreakers, standing with their backs to the wall in a way that gave them sight lines in both directions. They weren't hospital security. Security stood with their weight on their heels, bored and tired, and counting the minutes until the end of their shift. These men stood on the balls of their feet, hands clasped loosely in front of their waists, ready to draw weapons that Sarah couldn't see but knew were there. The second pair was near the elevator bank, speaking quietly into earpieces that they weren't bothering to hide. The third was at the nurse's station, asking questions of a terrified-looking receptionist who kept glancing at Sarah and then quickly looking away. Perimeter breach, Sarah thought automatically. They've secured the exits and they're working their way inward. She picked up a stack of towels from a linen cart and started walking, keeping her head down and her pace slow. The key to moving through hostile territory wasn't to hide. It was to look like you belonged exactly where you were. She was a nurse carrying towels. Nothing suspicious. Nothing worth a second glance. She passed the pair near the elevator and felt their eyes track her for a moment before dismissing her as irrelevant. Middle-aged woman. Oversized scrubs. Thick glasses. Orthopedic shoes. Everything about Sarah Hayes screamed not a threat, and these men had been trained to identify threats, not to look past the camouflage. "Excuse me, ma'am." Sarah stopped. One of the men from the fire exit had intercepted her, a hard-faced operative with pockmarked skin and cold eyes that evaluated her with professional detachment. "We're looking for the nurse who attended to the patient in room 404. The John Doe with the gunshot wounds. Do you know where she is?" Sarah widened her eyes and let her lip tremble slightly. "Oh, that was terrible what happened up there. Is the patient okay? Did he hurt anyone?" "He's fine. We just need to ask the nurse some questions. Do you know where we can find her, I think?" Sarah paused, making a show of trying to remember. I think Sarah went to the cafeteria. She was really shaken up by what happened. Ground floor through the main lobby. The operative nodded and tapped his earpiece. "Target is mobile. Cafeteria ground floor. Move." Both men brushed past her, heading for the elevators. Sarah watched them go, maintaining her confused expression until they were out of sight. Then she turned and walked in the opposite direction toward room 404. The police guard, who should have been stationed outside Dimitri's room, was gone. The hallway was empty, except for the dim emergency lighting that had replaced the normal fluorescence at some point in the last few minutes. Someone had cut the power to this floor. Sarah slipped into the room and found Dimitri awake, his eyes fever-bright and his breathing labored. He whispered, "You should have run." "I don't run from fights," Sarah said. Not anymore. She moved quickly, grabbing a pair of trauma shears from the wall mount and taping them to the underside of the bed rail where she could reach them in a hurry. She checked his IVs, his vitals, his bandages, looking for anything that might be useful. How many, Dimitri asked. At least 8 inside. Probably more outside, establishing a perimeter. They've cut power to this floor and they're jamming communications. She looked at him with the cold calculation of an operative assessing assets. "Can you move? I can try." Before she could respond, the lights throughout the hospital flickered and died. Completely. The backup generators kicked in a second later, bathing everything in a dim red emergency wash that turned the hallways into something out of a nightmare. The PA system clicked on, but no voice came through. Just a static, soft and sinister, and somehow more frightening than any words could have been. Then she heard the boots. Heavy footsteps, not the rhythmic patrol of security guards, but the aggressive coordinated movement of a breach team advancing through hostile territory. They were coming up the stairwell, at least 4 sets of boots moving in tactical formation. Sarah cracked the door and looked out. 4 men in full tactical gear were advancing down the hallway toward room 404. They wore black plate carriers and carried suppressed rifles, and they moved with the fluid coordination of apex predators who knew exactly what they were hunting. At the front of the formation, Dr. Julian Hartwell was standing in their path, his face red with indignation and his voice raised in the particular tone of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. "You cannot come in here. This is a sterile environment. I am the chief resident of this hospital, and I demand to know what authority you have to." The leader of the tactical team backhanded him across the face with the gloved fist, dropping him to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The team stepped over his unconscious body without breaking stride. "Clear the floor," the leader said, and his voice was cold and mechanical. "Find the Russian. Find the nurse. No witnesses." Sarah gently closed the door. She looked at Dimitri, who had struggled into a sitting position on the bed. She looked at the trauma shears taped to the bed rail, the only weapon she had. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. Gray scrubs, messy hair, thick glasses. The disguise she had worn for 3 years. The lie she had lived. She reached up and pulled the elastic band from her hair, letting her blonde waves fall loose around her shoulders. She took off the glasses and crushed them under her heel with a satisfying crunch. Then she stripped off the oversized scrub top, revealing the tight black thermal she wore underneath and the scars that covered her arms like a map of every battle she had ever survived. Dimitri breathed. "What are you doing?" Sarah grabbed the canister of pressurized ether from the crash cart in the corner. She pulled a roll of medical tape from the drawer. She tested the weight of the trauma shears in her hand. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It wasn't the soft murmur of Sarah Hayes anymore. It was something colder, harder, more dangerous. "They came into my hospital," she said. "They threatened my patients, my colleagues." She moved to the door and wedged a chair under the handle, buying them a few precious seconds. That was their last mistake. The door to room 404 was locked, but that wouldn't hold them for long. Sarah had maybe 90 seconds before they breached, and she needed to make every one of them count. She worked with the cold efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before assembling a makeshift trap from the materials at hand. The oxygen canister from the wall mount went into the corner valve, cracked slightly open, filling the room with invisible flammable gas. The defibrillator unit from the crash cart went beside it, rigged to a timer made from a twisted tourniquet and the digital display of a thermometer. It wasn't elegant, but it would work. "Can you walk at all?" she asked Dimitri without looking at him. "I can try." "Where are we going, stairwell?" "There's a landing between the 3rd and 4th floors where I can stash you while I deal with the rest of them." She helped him out of the bed, taking most of his weight on her shoulders. He was heavy, far too heavy for a woman of her size to carry under normal circumstances. But Sarah had spent 10 years carrying wounded men through worse conditions than this. They slipped out of the room through the bathroom, which connected to an adjacent patient room that was currently empty. Sarah navigated them through the darkened corridors, using her intimate knowledge of the hospital layout to avoid the areas where she could hear boots moving. She got Dmitri to the stairwell and helped him settle against the concrete wall of the landing where he would be hidden from anyone looking up or down the stairs. "Stay here," she said. "Don't make a sound. If I'm not back in 20 minutes..." "You'll be back," Dmitri interrupted. "I've seen you work Eve. Those men have no idea what they're dealing with." Sarah allowed herself a small, cold smile. Then she turned and ghosted back into the hallway, moving toward room 404 and the trap she had left behind. She found a ventilation access panel in the ceiling of the corridor, just around the corner from Dmitri's room. She pulled herself up into the duct with an ease that would have surprised anyone who knew Sarah Hayes, and she crawled through the darkness until she was positioned directly above the hallway where the mercenaries would emerge. She heard them breach the door 30 seconds later. The sound of splintering wood was followed by boots thundering into the room, weapons sweeping across empty space. Clear, left clear, right room is clear, target is gone. Sarah smiled in the darkness of the duct. 3 seconds later, the defibrillator sparked and ignited the oxygen-rich atmosphere in the room. The explosion wasn't a Hollywood fireball. It was a concussive blast that blew the door off its hinges and slammed the 3 mercenaries inside against the walls, hard enough to crack plaster. Sarah dropped from the duct into the corridor behind the 4th mercenary, the one who had been guarding their backs. He was stunned by the blast, disoriented, reaching for his weapon too slowly. She drove a syringe of succinylcholine into the exposed flesh of his neck, right in the gap between his helmet and body armor. The paralytic hit his bloodstream instantly, and he dropped like a stone, fully conscious, but unable to move or breathe. Sarah caught him before he hit the floor and dragged him into a supply closet, stripping him of his communications unit and his sidearm in the process. A suppressed Glock, 19 full magazine. She checked the chamber and slipped the earpiece into her ear. Team 2 report. What was that explosion? Team 2 respond. The voice in her ear was angry and commanding. Someone in the lobby coordinating the operation. Sarah didn't respond. She just slipped back into the shadows and started hunting. The hospital had become Sarah's weapon. She moved through the building like water, using her knowledge of every shortcut and secret passage to stay one step ahead of the mercenaries who were now hunting her as desperately as she was hunting them. They had numbers and firepower, but she had something more valuable. 3 years of memorizing every inch of this building, every shadow and blind spot, every place where a woman could hide and wait for her prey to walk into range. She took the next one in the radiology department, using the maze of imaging rooms and storage closets to lead him away from his team before dropping him with a chokehold that left him unconscious but breathing. She took another in the pediatric ward, empty for renovations, where a nail gun left behind by contractors became an improvised weapon that put 2 3-inch framing nails through his kneecap before he even knew she was there. She didn't kill them. She disabled them, restrained them, and moved on. But she was running out of time and ammunition. The Glock had started with 15 rounds, and she had used 4. The mercenaries were getting smarter, moving in larger groups covering each other's blind spots. They had stopped underestimating her, and that made them more dangerous. She needed to get to the server room on the 5th floor. Dmitri's evidence was still inside him, but the hospital had a hardwired connection to the CDC for pandemic, reporting a dedicated fiber optic line that couldn't be jammed. If she could upload the files through that connection, they would reach the Pentagon within minutes, and not even Dominic Kane would be able to bury the truth. But the server room was heavily guarded. She had seen at least 3 mercenaries positioned in the corridor outside, and there was no way to approach without being seen. She needed a distraction, something big enough to draw them away from their positions. She needed to make them come to her. The radiology department was dark and quiet when Sarah slipped inside, moving through the maze of imaging rooms until she reached the MRI suite. The massive machine sat in the center of the room like a sleeping giant, its magnetic field powerful enough to rip the fillings from a man's teeth if he got too close. Sarah had an idea. A terrible, brilliant idea. She found Dmitri in the storage room where she'd hidden him, weaker than before, but still conscious. "I need you to stay here," she told him. "No matter what you hear, don't move. I'm going to draw them in, and then I'm going to end this. How many are left? 6, maybe 7. Plus their commander." Sarah checked her ammunition. 7 rounds. It would have to be enough. The server room is on the 5th floor. Once I clear the path, I'll come back for you and we'll upload the evidence together. And if you don't come back, Sarah met his eyes. Then you drag yourself to that server room and you finish what we started. Kane doesn't get to win. Not this time. She slipped out of the storage room and made her way to the corridor outside the MRI suite. She knew the mercenaries were tracking her movements through thermal imaging, so she made herself easy to find. She wanted them to come. Two of them found her 3 minutes later, advancing down the hallway with their rifles raised and their confidence restored by superior numbers. One of them was enormous, a wall of muscle with a scar running down his face that looked like it had been made by a knife. Victor, Kane's personal bodyguard. She recognized him from the intelligence briefings she had studied a lifetime ago. End of the line, Captain Victor said, and his voice was thick with satisfaction. Kane told us you were good, but you're not good enough. Not against all of us. Sarah backed away, letting fear show on her face, playing the role of a cornered animal. She stumbled through the doorway into the room adjacent to the MRI suite, pressing herself against the wall that separated her from the massive magnetic machine. Victor followed her confident, now his rifle lowered slightly, because he knew she had nowhere left to run. Kane sends his regards, he said, stepping closer. He's been waiting 10 years for this moment. 10 years of hunting for the woman who took his eye and destroyed his reputation. And now he's going to watch you die. Sarah's hand closed around the metal oxygen wrench she had picked up in the supply room. She held it behind her back, waiting for exactly the right moment. Tell Kane something for me, she said. What's that? Tell him I'm coming for his other eye. She threw the wrench not at Victor, but past him toward the thin drywall that separated this room from the MRI suite. The wrench hit the wall and punched straight through, drawn by the immense magnetic field of the machine on the other side. Victor's eyes went wide as he realized what was happening. He was wearing a plate carrier with steel inserts. He was carrying a rifle with a steel barrel. His belt buckle was steel. His dog tags were steel. The magnetic field grabbed him like an invisible hand and yanked him off his feet. He screamed as he flew through the air, crashing through the drywall and slamming against the MRI machine with enough force to dent the housing. His weapons and armor pinned him to the surface, crushing him against the metal, and no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. Sarah walked through the hole in the wall and looked down at him. You should have done your research, she said calmly. I spent 3 years working in this hospital. I know every piece of equipment, every system, every weakness. She pistol-whipped him into unconsciousness and took his radio. 5 mercenaries left, and their commander. Sarah reached the server room on the 5th floor, but she wasn't alone. She had been too focused on Victor, too confident after her victory in the MRI suite. She didn't see the second team until they were already surrounding her. 6 rifles pointed at her head from every direction. Drop the weapon, the team leader commanded. Hands behind your head, now. Sarah considered her options. 6 targets, 7 rounds, and they were too spread out for her to take them all before at least one of them put a bullet in her skull. She could fight, but she would lose. She dropped the Glock and raised her hands. They zip-tied her wrists behind her back and forced her to her knees in the middle of the server room. The computers hummed around her, connected to the outside world through the fiber optic line that she had been so desperate to reach. Command, we have the target secured. The team leader reported into his radio. Server room, 5th floor, awaiting further instructions. The response came through the speakers, and it wasn't a faceless voice from the lobby. It was a voice that Sarah had heard in her nightmares for 10 years. Excellent work. I'm on my way up. Keep her alive until I get there. I want to see her face. 2 minutes later, the elevator doors opened and Dominic Kane walked into the server room. He was older than she remembered, his hair gone silver, and his face lined with the years, but his eyes were the same. Cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. The eye patch over his left socket was a constant reminder of their last encounter, the night she had taken his eye and escaped into the darkness. Hello, Eve, he said, and his voice was smooth and pleasant, like they were old friends meeting for coffee. You look terrible. Nursing doesn't suit you. Kane. Sarah's voice was flat and empty. I should have killed you in Syria. Yes, you should have. He circled her slowly, looking down at her like she was an interesting specimen in a laboratory. But you didn't. You ran instead. You hid for 10 years playing dress-up as a nobody nurse in a nobody hospital, and you thought I would never find you? How did you find me? Your Russian friend led me right to you. We've been tracking him for months, waiting to see where he would run when we applied pressure. I never imagined he would lead us to the great Captain Cross hiding in plain sight. Kane smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to go. The irony is delicious, don't you think? He walked to the computer terminal and looked at the screen. I see you were trying to upload something. The evidence that Dmitri has been carrying for all these years, I assume. The names, the dates, the proof of what we did in Syria. He pulled a tablet from his jacket and showed her the screen. It was a live feed from the hospital lobby, where 30 hostages were kneeling on the wet pavement with guns pointed at their heads. Sarah recognized faces in the crowd. Lisa, Chen Maria, Dr. Hartwell, with his expensive suit ruined and his face streaked with tears. And Emma Wallace, her pink scrubs visible even in the grainy footage, her young face pale with terror. Here's what's going to happen, Kane said pleasantly. You're going to tell me where Dmitri is hiding, and you're going to give me that flash drive. If you cooperate, I'll let these people live. If you don't, he pressed a button on his tablet, and one of the mercenaries in the lobby raised his rifle and fired a round into the ceiling. The hostages screamed, and Emma Wallace fell forward, covering her head with her hands. The next one won't be a warning shot, Kane said. Choose wisely, Captain. Sarah looked at the tablet screen at the faces of the people she had spent 3 years protecting without them ever knowing it. The nurses who had dismissed her as furniture. The doctors who had screamed at her and belittled her and never once looked closely enough to see what she really was. The patients who had held her hand in the dark hours of the night, trusting her with their lives. They were all going to die if she didn't give Kane what he wanted. You're bluffing, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. You killed those hostages, and every law enforcement agency in the country comes down on your head. You'll never make it out of Seattle. Kane laughed a dry and hollow sound. You think I care about law enforcement? I own half the generals in the Pentagon, Eve. I have senators on my payroll. The evidence that Dmitri is carrying could embarrass some very powerful people, and those people will do anything to make sure it never sees the light of day. He leaned close to her, his breath hot against her face. You know what happened to your team in Syria. You know I can make anyone disappear. These hostages, this hospital, none of it matters. All that matters is that evidence and the man who's carrying it. Sarah looked at the upload bar on the computer screen. Dmitri had given her the flash drive before she left him, and she had plugged it in before the mercenaries captured her. The upload was at 45% frozen when she had been forced to her knees. If she could restart it, the evidence would reach the Pentagon in minutes. But Kane would kill the hostages before that happened. She looked at Emma's face on the tablet screen, young and terrified, and trusting that someone would save her. She looked at the faces of all the other people she had protected in secret for 3 years. People who had never known that the invisible nurse was watching over them. She couldn't let them die. That was the whole reason she had become a nurse. The whole reason she had chosen healing over killing. She couldn't sacrifice innocent lives, not even for justice. The Russian is in the radiology storage room on the 3rd floor, Sarah said, and the words tasted like ashes in her mouth. The flash drive is in my pocket. Take it. Just let them go. Kane smiled and reached into her pocket, pulling out the small metal device that contained 10 years of evidence and the names of everyone responsible for the Syria massacre. Smart girl, he said. I knew you'd see reason eventually. He turned to his men. Go get the Russian and bring him to the roof. We're leaving. He looked back at Sarah with something that might have been respect. You know I can't let you live, Eve. You've seen too much and you've caused too much trouble. But I'll make it quick for old time's sake. What about the hostages? Kane's smile widened. Oh, I'm going to kill them anyway. You didn't really think I'd let witnesses walk away, did you? The moment we're in the air, my men will open fire. And you'll die knowing that your sacrifice meant nothing. Sarah felt something break inside her. Not her spirit, not her will to fight, but the last chain that had been holding Captain Evelyn Cross in check. She had tried to be Sarah Hayes. She had tried to choose healing over killing, peace over war, invisibility over confrontation, and it had all been for nothing. Kane was going to kill everyone she cared about, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. Unless... Kane, she said, and something in her voice made him pause. You forgot something. What's that? You forgot to check if I called for backup. The rooftop of St. Jude's Medical Center was a hurricane of wind and rain and chaos. The Black Phoenix helicopter sat on the landing pad with its rotors spinning ready for extraction. Kane's remaining mercenaries had dragged Dmitri up from the storage room and were loading him into the aircraft. Sarah was being escorted at gunpoint, her hands still bound behind her back, toward the same helicopter that would carry her to her death. But Kane didn't know about the phone call she'd made before entering the server room. The old Nokia burner phone hidden in her boot had connected her to a number she hadn't dialed in 10 years. A direct line to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Captain Evelyn Cross was officially dead, but her service number was still in the system. And when she had spoken those words requesting immediate support, the wheels had started turning. Agent Michael Ross of the FBI was listening. He had been listening from the moment Sarah's distress beacon had activated, and his tactical teams were already in position on the adjacent rooftops. All she needed was a signal. Kane walked beside her, his pistol pressed against her ribs, his voice raised above the roar of the helicopter. Any last words, Captain? Any final wisdom you'd like to share before I end this? Sarah looked at him, at the man who had killed her team and destroyed her life and hunted her for a decade. She looked at the flash drive in his hand, at Dimitri being loaded into the helicopter at the mercenaries, with their rifles pointed at her head. And she smiled. Just one thing she said. You should have searched me more carefully. She twisted her body, bringing her bound hands around to her front with a flexibility that shouldn't have been possible, and in the same motion, she grabbed the flash drive from Kane's hand and hurled it toward the spinning tail rotor of the helicopter. Kane's eyes followed the arc of the drive, widening with horror. His mercenaries looked up instinctively, their attention diverted for just a fraction of a second. That fraction of a second was all the FBI snipers needed. 4 shots rang out simultaneously, barely audible over the helicopter noise, and 4 mercenaries dropped where they stood. The 5th spun toward the source of the gunfire, and Sarah was already moving, slamming her shoulder into Kane's chest and driving him backward. They crashed to the wet concrete of the rooftop, rolling across the surface in a tangle of limbs and fury. Kane was trained, dangerous, stronger than she was, but Sarah was fighting with something beyond training. She was fighting with 10 years of rage and grief and the memory of everyone she had lost. She got her bound hands around his throat and squeezed. Kane's fist connected with her jaw, snapping her head back, but she held on. He drove his knee into her ribs, and she felt something crack, but she held on. He clawed at her face, her eyes, but she held on. You killed them, she hissed through gritted teeth. Martinez, Chen, Williams, Kowalski, you killed my family? Kane's face was turning purple, his eye bulging, his hands scrabbling uselessly at her grip. They knew too much, he gasped. They were loose ends, just like you. Sarah's hands tightened. She could feel his pulse beneath her fingers, feel his life slipping away, and she wanted it. She wanted to watch the light fade from his eye, wanted to feel the moment when his heart stopped beating. She wanted revenge. Sarah, stop! The voice cut through the roar of the wind and the rain, and Sarah froze. Emma Wallace was standing in the doorway to the roof access stairwell, her pink scrub soaked and her face streaked with tears. She had followed them up from the lobby, ignoring every order Sarah had given her, because she couldn't stand by and do nothing while the woman she admired walked to her death. Don't do this, Emma pleaded. Please, Sarah. This isn't who you are. Kane laughed, a wet and desperate sound. She doesn't know you at all, does she? She doesn't know what you really are. A killer. A monster. Just like me. Sarah looked at her hands wrapped around Kane's throat. They were covered in blood, his and hers, and they were shaking with the effort of not crushing his windpipe. She looked at her reflection in the rain-slicked surface of his eye patch, and she saw a face she barely recognized. Hard, cold, merciless. She looked at Emma, at the young woman who had seen something worth admiring in the invisible nurse who brought donuts on Fridays. You held Mrs. Patterson's hand when she was scared. Emma said, and her voice was breaking, you caught Dr. Hartwell's medication error and you didn't tell anyone because you knew it would ruin his career. You remembered everyone's birthday. You stayed late with the dying patients so they wouldn't be alone. Sarah's grip loosened slightly. The memories Emma was describing felt like they belonged to someone else, to a woman who had existed before tonight. That woman is real, Emma said. Sarah Hayes is real. She's standing right here and she's not a killer. Kane coughed, gasping for air. She's lying to herself. Sarah Hayes was always a mask. The real woman is the one with her hands around my throat. Sarah looked at Kane. She looked at Emma. She looked at the FBI tactical teams rappelling onto the rooftop, securing the area, taking the surviving mercenaries into custody. And she made a choice. You're wrong, she said to Kane, and her voice was quiet and steady. Sarah Hayes was the best thing I ever became. She was weak and invisible and forgettable, and she was the strongest person I've ever been. She released his throat and stood up, stepping back as FBI agents rushed forward to take him into custody. Kane stared up at her, confusion and rage warring on his purple face. You're letting me live. After everything I did, Sarah looked down at him with something that might have been pity. I'm not letting you live because you deserve mercy. I'm letting you live because I'm not the monster you tried to turn me into. She turned to Emma, who was standing frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Sarah said softly, for seeing me, the real me. Then her legs gave out, and the world went dark. Sarah woke up to the smell of antiseptic and the soft beeping of monitors. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. Then she recognized the ceiling tiles, the particular shade of institutional green on the walls, the way the morning light filtered through the blinds. She was in Bay 4, her bay. The same trauma bed where she had treated hundreds of patients over 3 years. Welcome back, Captain. She turned her head and found Agent Michael Ross sitting in a plastic chair beside her bed. He looked exhausted, his salt and pepper hair disheveled and his suit rumpled, but his eyes were warm. The hostages, Sarah asked, and her voice came out as a rasp. Safe. All 30 of them. Kane's men surrendered the moment we breached the lobby. Turns out mercenaries lose their nerve pretty quickly when they realize they're outgunned. Dimitri stable. The surgeons removed the flash drive from his abdomen, and we've already begun uploading the contents to secure servers. The evidence is comprehensive. Names, dates, financial records, communications. Kane's entire operation is going to collapse, and a lot of very powerful people are going to prison. Sarah closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 10 years. It's over. It's over, Ross confirmed. And Captain, thank you. For everything. A commotion outside the door made Sarah open her eyes again. She heard raised voices, the sound of boots on linoleum, and then the curtain was ripped aside and Dr. Julian Hartwell burst into the room. He looked terrible. His expensive suit was ruined. His face was bruised and swollen from where the mercenary had hit him, and his eyes were wild with an emotion that Sarah couldn't identify. Sarah. He stopped short when he saw her lying in the bed, bandaged and bruised and hooked up to half a dozen monitors. You're alive. Dr. Hartwell. Sarah's voice was flat. You should be resting. I should be. He shook his head, struggling to find words. The things they're saying about you. The FBI, the news, they're saying you're some kind of... that you were a soldier, Sarah said quietly. I was a soldier, a long time ago. Hartwell stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Like he was finally looking at her, really looking the way he never had in 3 years of working alongside her. You saved my life, he whispered. You saved all of us. Before Sarah could respond, the doors at the end of the corridor burst open again. 6 men in full tactical gear marched into the emergency room, their boots thundering against the floor in perfect unison. They were covered in mud and rain, their weapons slung across their chests, and they moved with the disciplined precision of soldiers who had seen combat and survived. The hospital staff parted before them like water before a ship. Nurses pressed themselves against walls. Doctors stepped out of their path. Emma Wallace stood frozen near the nurse's station, her hand pressed against her mouth. The lead operator stopped at the foot of Sarah's bed. He was young, maybe 30, with the hard eyes of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. He snapped his heels together, and the sound echoed through the silent emergency room like a gunshot. He raised his hand to his brow in a crisp, perfect military salute. Captain Hayes, he said, and his voice was thick with respect. The President of the United States sends his regards. Transport is waiting whenever you're ready. Behind him, the other 5 operators saluted in unison. Dr. Hartwell's mouth fell open. Emma Wallace started crying, tears of joy streaming down her face. The nurses who had dismissed Sarah as furniture for 3 years stared in disbelief at the woman they had never really seen. Sarah Hayes, battered and bruised and wearing a hospital gown, slowly pushed herself up in bed. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she forced herself to sit upright, forced her spine to straighten, forced her chin to rise. She returned the salute with a hand that didn't tremble at all. Ready for transport, she said. Sarah swung her legs out of the hospital bed and stood up accepting a robe that Agent Ross handed her. Her body ached in a dozen different places, but she had survived worse. The FBI operators formed up around her in honor guard for a fallen hero who had risen from the ashes. As she walked toward the door, the hospital staff lined the corridors, watching in silence as the woman they had ignored for 3 years passed by for the last time. Sarah paused in front of Dr. Hartwell, who was standing near the nurse's station with tears streaming down his face. 2 milligrams of lorazepam, doctor, she said softly. Not 4. Always check the patient's respiratory history before administering sedatives. Hartwell stared at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. The night she had corrected him, the night he had screamed at her in front of the entire emergency room, she had saved his patient's life and his career in the same breath. I'm sorry, he whispered, for everything. The way I treated you, the things I said. Don't apologize to me, Sarah said. Apologize to every nurse you've ever dismissed as furniture. They're the ones keeping your patients alive while you take the credit. She turned and saw Emma Wallace standing by the doors, clutching Sarah's discarded name tag in both hands. Sarah, Emma's voice broke. Will I ever see you again? Sarah reached out and touched the young woman's cheek, wiping away a tear with her thumb. Sarah Hayes died tonight, she said gently. But maybe someday someone new will show up on the night shift. Someone who brings donuts on Fridays and remembers everyone's birthdays. She leaned in and kissed Emma's forehead. Keep watching, she whispered. Keep seeing the people that everyone else ignores. That's the most important thing you can do. Then she turned and walked out of St. Jude's Medical Center, flanked by soldiers leaving behind the life she had built and the woman she had pretended to be. The red dress she had worn to the charity gala still hung in her locker, the only beautiful thing she had ever owned as Sarah Hayes. Dr. Hartwell found it later that evening when he went to clean out her things. He held it for a long moment, remembering the woman who had worn it, the woman who had hidden a warrior's heart beneath a servant's mask. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a box with her name tag and a note that read, "For the bravest person I never knew." And that is the incredible story of Sarah Hayes, the ghost nurse of Seattle. For 3 years, she walked the halls of St. Jude's Medical Center as an invisible woman, absorbing cruelty from doctors who saw her as furniture and dismissal from colleagues who never looked closely enough to see the truth. She chose healing over killing, peace over war, anonymity over recognition. And when the darkness came for her, when the ghosts of her past threatened everyone she had sworn to protect, she rose to meet them with the courage that left everyone who witnessed it forever changed. She proved that true strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition or praise. It simply waits quiet and patient until the moment when it's needed most. The next time you pass a stranger on the street, the next time you dismiss someone as ordinary or forgettable, remember Sarah Hayes. Remember that behind every pair of tired eyes might be a warrior's heart. Remember that the person serving you coffee or checking your vitals or changing your sheets might be the only thing standing between you and the darkness. Remember that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear scrubs, and sometimes they wear borrowed red dresses to charity galas, counting the exits and calculating the sight lines, ready to fight and die for people who never even knew their name. Now I want to ask you something. Think about the people you see every day. The cashier at the grocery store, the janitor at your office, the quiet coworker who never speaks up in meetings. What do you really know about them? What battles have they fought that you'll never hear about? What strength are they hiding behind a smile? Here's a question I want you to answer in the comments. Have you ever completely misjudged someone only to discover later that they were far more extraordinary than you ever imagined? Tell me your story. I want to hear it. If this story gave you chills, if it made you think twice about the invisible people in your life, do me a favor. Smash that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it helps this video reach more people who need to hear this message. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. We post incredible tales of hidden heroes, ordinary people who turned out to be extraordinary, and real-life legends who walked among us without anyone ever knowing. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with that friend who's going through a hard time, who feels invisible, who thinks they don't matter. Remind them that Sarah Hayes felt the same way. And look what she became. Drop a comment below with the words, "Captain Hayes," if you made it to the end. I read every single comment, and I want to know that you're part of this community. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for seeing the invisible people. We'll see you in the next one.